Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. Super excited to be back down at Juniper Level Botanic Garden and Plant Delights Nursery with Tony Avent, here to talk about Lycoris, or otherwise known as what? Hurricane lilies, surprise lilies, red spider lilies, you know, any others. Hurricane lily, I think, comes from down on the Gulf Coast. They tend to bloom about the time they're getting hurricane season, that kind of thing. Surprise lily, because you don't know they're here.
That's right. One day they're not, and the next day they're here.
So you have an incredible collection of them. Can you?
Well, yeah, we've always been fascinated by surprise lilies, but there's only really two in widespread commerce, and that's Lycoris radiata, which is this one right here, and Lycoris squamidra, which is long past. Both of those have been grown in the U.S. for 150 years. And so we began to explore and find out what more was out there, and we track down. There's really three groups of breeders. There's one breeder really in China. There's probably a half dozen fairly well-known breeders in Japan, Kumayura being the most well-known, and Kurita, who's since passed away, did incredible work with Lycoris. In the U.S., we basically have two breeders, and that was the late Sam Caldwell of Tennessee. Sam was really the pioneer. I mean, Sam started writing about Lycoris back in the 40s and 50s, bred up through the early 70s. And then his protege, Phil Adams, of now in California, Phil took all of Sam Caldwell's work and took that further. So it's really those two guys in the U.S. have been responsible for the majority of the Lycoris.
So how many species are there versus, I mean, I see that they're on, if you look up on Wikipedia, there's 20 or something, right?
Exactly, yeah. It generally ranges from in the 20s. Realistically, what we've determined is only 6 species.
Okay, gotcha.
What's happened through the years is when they find a new Lycoris in the wild, almost all of them are Chinese native, a few Korea, maybe one in Japan, depending on whether they brought it in from China or not. They actually hybridize in the wild. And so every time somebody finds a new hybrid, they name it as a new species. And it's not a new species, it's a hybrid. And so once we started really assembling the collections that we have, especially with many of them with wild known data, it's very easy to then take that work and look at the DNA work that's been done for, again, since the 20s. This is not new. They've been doing DNA analysis and realize there's actually only 6 species. Now they're divided into 2 basic groups. Those that form the foliage in the fall and those that form in the spring. So like Lycoris is one of those plants, it flowers with no foliage. Leaves come up afterwards. So the fall foliage ones are, again, there's only 2. Radiata, which is the one we all know. The leaves come up on that September, October-ish. They grow through the winter. And the other is one called Aurea, which is a very tall plant, 3 to 4 foot tall. Both of those are considered tender by northern growers. They're fine certainly here in this area. And then the spring ones, because the foliage doesn't emerge till after winter or late winter, those can survive all the way up into Minnesota. So much different plant.
So, and that's going to be a lot of the things in this amaryllis family, like agapanthus, where if you can get the foliage to go down, just please go under the ground. Then they'll survive almost any winter. But if the foliage is sitting there, they're exposed and they're because so many amaryllids have winter foliage, and that's the key. Now, if we have a mild winter, all of them will come through fine. But if we have a really hard winter, all those foliage of those spring ones, you will not get good bloom the next year, because the bloom is all dependent on the energy that foliage makes during the winter. And that's why you've got to have that foliage protected in the winter. So what we've determined is, now while Lycoris, especially in this area, we're growing them in full sun, if we have a hard winter, we will have very poor flowering next year because the foliage gets burned. Whereas if you put Lycoris in light deciduous shade, so that in the wintertime you got branches over it but no foliage, that's where the foliage will maximize its energy buildup, and you will get the best blooms, not in full sun. And probably a little less frost. under a little bit of a canopy.
Absolutely.
Like that.
It's very protective. So wild Lycoris will grow in full sun. You'll see plenty on there. Your bloom is always better under deciduous trees. Now, don't put them under evergreens because then they get no light. And so they're not going to produce foliage. That's the same as frying them in the wintertime. Okay, this is Lycoris rosea, and this is probably the most prolific of the hybrid Lycoris. And rosea is really neat because the tips are blue and the flower ranges from pink to almost a bright red. Now this is a cross between the radiata we looked at with the sort of scarlet flowers and one called the spring bloomers called Lycoris springeri. And springeri is where all the pink in Lycoris comes from, that one species. Now most of those have finished. We got just a few in bloom. But that is a light pink with blue tips, and some flowers can go to almost solid blue. It's an incredible color. But rosea is just an amazing thing, and we can have roseas bloom from late July all the way through early September. So rosea is an amazing plant, and you can have 50 different roseas, and you can have one that'll bloom one week, another one that'll bloom another week, and then follow that. So typically, a Lycoris flower comes out one day, and that would be a young flower, and then it ages the second day, and then really you've got about 3 days for each individual flower. Now, you've got a flower head with 8 to 10 flowers, so you've got, depending on the weather, and obviously in mid-90s, they're not going to last as long, those flowers will last for a week to 2 weeks. And then from each bulb, you have more than one stalk. So let's take a look at Lycoris bulbs. So this is what grows underground. So these are the bulbs, and Lycoris bulbs can get pretty large. And what they will do to offset is they will form a new bud off to the side. And these bulbs will naturally separate, or you can come in and just pop them off. And as long as you get that little basal plate, that little thing right there, you can plant that. So this one has multiplied from 1 and it's now into 4. So I can pull all those apart. And then you can continue to pull those apart, and then you've got 4. So they're easy to separate. You can move Lycoris anytime the ground is not froze. We move them in full flower. They don't miss a beat. It's one of those plants that's almost impossible to kill. Now, a lot of people have had trouble getting Lycoris to flower. That's because they buy dried bulbs. Most bulbs, you know, through the Dutch bulb houses are also dry. Lycoris are notorious for being really slow to ever bloom once you dry them out completely. So that's why the Lycoris collectors all prefer to buy plants grown in the green or grown in pots. So we're one of the very few nurseries that grows these in containers. When you buy it, you don't get a dry bulb shipped. You get something that's actually growing. And for some reason, Lycoris are much better at actually getting you flowers. If you got them in the wrong conditions, you buy a dry bulb, you can have, I've had Lycoris 10 to 15 years with no flower. They'll produce the foliage every fall, no flower. And that means they either got dried out too much at one point outside of the ground, or they're in sun and they're just not getting enough energy each year. So Lycoris are tough, but getting them to flower as long as you got the right conditions. We've also found a lot of difference in which clones flower well. So we keep flower data on these. We now have just under 700 different Lycoris selections. So we go out and we keep flower data, and so we've got now a decade of history. We can tell you this one blooms every 5 years, this one blooms every 2 years, this one blooms every year. And so the ones that we wind up naming and introducing to the trade are those that bloom every year. We're not really interested, I don't think most people care to have a bulb that doesn't bloom but once every 5 years. That's just not what you want in your gardens. Okay, so if you're ever interested in playing around with creating new ones, you certainly can. It's not a fast process. So Lycoris is generally going to be 5 years from seed to flower. But we can take flowers, like this is one of the yellowish hybrids, and there's 2 different groups. There's Lycoris albiflora and Lycoris straminia. Both look very similar. Flowers come out yellow and age to this beautiful peach. Some go to very much of an orange. This is albiflora, and this one is sterile, which means you can't set any seed on that. But you can take the pollen. So each one has 6 stamens with the pollen, so you can pull that out. And then you go on this one, which is a rosea. This is the hybrid of Springeri and radiata. And you look for, again, they have 6 that have pollen. This one actually, the pollen's already gone. But you find the stigma, the one that has nothing, and actually should be a little bit sticky. And you just take the pollen and dust that on there. And rosea sets, actually, even though it's a hybrid, sets very good seed. And so and we would go in and do all the flowers. And you want to do them before the insects come in and do them, because then you're not going to get the cross that you want. So they generally open up early in the morning. So you want to be out here fairly early and go around and make all your crosses. And then you just wait for seed. And the seed produced fairly quickly, generally about 4 to 6 weeks. Those seed will be ready. You can see the seed beginning to form here, and they'll swell up. They get about 3 times that size. And they open up, and they're like little black BBs. They're very small and very hard. And then plant them immediately. You can plant them directly in the ground. You can plant them in a container. They're fairly easy. And it's really fun to see. If you just let them open pollinate, you're pretty much going to get duplicates of this, or something in this range with that reddish purple to pink flowers.
So there's a really wide range of time on these. Even though they're short, each individual one is short-lived, you can really cover a span of time.
You really can. Lycoris season for us starts around the 4th of July with some of the very early stuff. Mm-hmm. And even within a species like radiata, which here we are the end of August, 1st of September, that's just coming in. We have a radiata that blooms in July.
Right.
So you really have a bloom period for Lycoris from July all the way up into early October. So that's pretty amazing. I mean, you don't have that with narcissus, with tulips. You pretty much have a very short window, but if you pick enough different Lycoris, you can have that several month window of time. You can see some that are spent already, they're finishing up, some that are just coming out of the ground. From the time they emerge from the ground, you've got about a week before they're in flower. Now, to most people that just pass by your garden quickly, you go out there one day and you haven't seen it, and it's like surprise. Hence that name.
Surprise lily.
But if you watch them very closely, it does take about a week from the time they emerge till the time they're in bloom. The spring species, which we haven't talked much about, there's 4. Springeri, which is, I mentioned, where all the pink ones come from. That's just an amazing color. That's sort of a psychedelic colors from something back in the 70s that we used to love. Then you have one called Longituba, which has, obviously, long tubes.
Right.
And that's where all the whites come in. And Longituba is a very long flower. And so the one that everybody knows, Squamidra, Longituba is one of the parents of that. We have Sanguinea, which is probably the most difficult to grow in our area. That's not a plant for the South. That's primarily a Korean species, Japanese, small thing, orange flowers, but we've only had 2 to flower in several decades here. So that's not one you really want to work with. And then Chinensis, which is this incredibly gaudy orange gold.
Right.
It's interesting because we have Chinensis and Aurea, which if you looked at the 2 flowers, they look absolutely identical. They're huge, they're frilly, they're just gaudy colors. But Aurea, the foliage comes up in September. Chinensis, the foliage doesn't come up until March. So those are 2 plants separated at birth. They look the same. Some of them will actually overlap in flowering, but they create hybrids that are either much hardier or less hardy. Now, the interesting thing about breeding is if you cross a spring leaf one with a fall leaf one, they always revert to fall leaves in the first generation. So that's not good for the people up north. It's great for us down here in the south because they come up. So to get one for the folks up north, you have to make that initial cross. Then you have to go back and cross it back onto the spring parent, and that moves the foliage emergence to January. And then you back cross it again, and that'll then get the color you want, but the foliage emergence will move back to spring. So that's really a 15 to 20 year process to take one that has foliage in the fall, get the color, and then move the emergence time of the leaves.
Right, because the seed, you're going to have 5 years to flower one from seed.
Yeah.
And then evaluating it.
Then you make another cross.
Making it, right.
And then making a third cross to get that foliage
20
back.
years, wow.
Yeah, so breeding plants, I mean, that's why people love things like iris and daylilies, because you got a really fast evaluation time.
Right.
Not so much with Lycoris.
Yeah.
Okay, so these are the two parents of the hybrid we mentioned called Lycoris rosea. So here's radiata and here's springeri, and this is the blue-tipped one that's very famous. So we got a fall emerger and a spring emerger. So the cross is called Lycoris rosea, which we mentioned earlier. So here is 3 examples, of Lycoris rosea. So you can see this has a lot more radiata blood in it. This has more springeri blood, and this is perfect intermediate between the two. So some of these represent many years of back crossing to get these different colors. But that's what the opportunities, and that's why we have people that have been breeding all these years, is trying to create better plants in all kind of range of different colors. It's really quite amazing. And then some of the flowers, especially on the yellows, tend to change a lot. So this is Lycoris straminia. This is a cross between chinensis, I mentioned, the big gaudy orange, and Lycoris radiata. So here's one of the parents, and the other parent is bright orange. And so they emerge yellow, almost pure yellow, and then the second day they start to age, and this is what that would look like 2 days later. It starts to infuse with pink. It's really quite incredible to watch the transition. So over a couple-day period, you go back out and you think, well, that can't even be the same plant, because it really does transform so much as it ages. It just picks up this incredibly beautiful, the stamens, anthers, all turn pink with age, which is amazing, because you see there's really very little pink in them now, just a little bit right here. But over a period of a couple days, they turn bright pink. So here are the 2 parents of Lycoris straminia. So this is radiata, and this is chinensis, fall leaf emerger, spring leaf emerger. And this is the parent here, Lycoris straminia. So you can see how it picked up colors from both parents. And like other things, the more times this is crossed back on the parent, that'll continue to change the colors. But it's really an amazing plant. And you see why, as it ages, with this beautiful pink here, it's picking up more of the color of the radiata as it ages.
One of the things with these surprise lilies is frequently Steph and I will be out exploring, and you'll see a row of these somewhere, but the house is gone. It's like old daffodils. You'll see that where there's a square of daffodils. It's like, it's some sort of history there.
Exactly. They tell a story. I found them several places. We'll be botanizing in the deep south, out in the woods. Right. And as you say, you always know that was an old house. Somebody lived here. There's history to the area. So Lycoris really do last, I mean, 100 years in the ground. I mean, that's nothing. Yeah.
So how are you going about actually doing production on these? Because you're selling them on, Plant Delights is selling them. Or during your open houses and that kind of thing. How are you producing them?
Well, sure. Well, once we trial them, so several years ago, we were able to acquire a collection of many hundred different varieties. They had never been fully trialed, they'd never been photographed, they'd never been evaluated. So we went through that process, which has taken us over a decade. Right. So everything we produce is produced here in the field. We produce it ourselves, because commercially, all the Lycoris you buy are produced in India. Right. And basically that's 2 different varieties, the squamidras and the radiatas. Occasionally you get a dealer from China that will grow them out in the fields. You'll see those enter the market. That happens about every 10 to 20 years. Yeah. So for us, we actually have to grow them, and it'll take us 5 years. We'll offer it once, might be another 5 years before we build up enough stock, and we grow ours again all in containers. So it's a very different process.
And you're digging them and dividing them. So it's no mechanical thing that's going to do this.
Yeah. No, we're digging them and dividing them. So it's not the wholesale production. And what drives the cost of bulbs down for the Dutch producers, the Indian producers, is labor is very cheap, but they do it on a very large scale. We do this on a very small scale, so we just don't have the the volume of scale that can get the cost down to, you know, a couple dollars a bulb. These specialty bulbs are never going to be in that market.
Knowing you, Tony, for a while, you know, for a while now, you don't do anything halfway. So you're jumping into Lycoris as, you know, I want to have them all. I want to work through all the confusion in it.
Yeah, well, that's what OCD people do. Is we can't just have one. We can't just stick our toe into it. We have to jump in at full scale. And so we were very fortunate to be able to acquire the largest collection in the United States, and then be able to bring in a lot of the Japanese hybrids as well. Because for us, if we're going to introduce something, we have to know it inside and out. So that's what we've spent the last decade, is growing these plants, evaluating these plants, deciding what's good, what works, where they grow the best. And it's all a learning process. And when we introduce something, we want to be able to share that breadth of knowledge so that people will be successful with the plants they grow. Right,
and accuracy. And there's an accuracy in putting an accuracy back in the world, you know,
That's very important.
Right. Well, thank you very much. This is one of my favorite seasons of the year when, you know, we're walking through the neighborhood and these things just start popping out of the ground. Like, what in the world, you know? I think for most people, you know, they probably just have no idea what's going on.
No, it's about the anticipation. That's what gardening is so wonderful. And these are so great because you just all of a sudden go out there, there they are.
Yeah. Thanks, Tony.
Thanks.